Hey, welcome back. As I said before, I was going to talk a little bit about the terminology associated with sand casting. There's a few things that I want you to understand, and that's the basic terms that you're going to hear every time you try to buy equipment, supplies, or talk to other casters. The first one is, what is sand casting? Sand casting is what we're doing right here, where we're using a type of sand or clay to cast materials. In general, that's sand casting. Different terms we have to think about is like this. In our crucible here, we have chunks of metal inside the crucible, and this chunk of metal is actually called a charge. That would be the material we're actually going to pour into the mold. So when you hear the term charge, that's actually the material that's going into the mold to create an object. Other terms we have to keep in mind is foundry. If we look right over here, this is one type of foundry right here. These are electric furnaces that heat the material inside the graphite crucibles. And so these are a type of furnace. They have gas furnaces. There's other types of electric furnaces. Like this would be another type of an electric furnace. It holds like a clay crucible, like usually refractory clay or one of those materials, inside here, and then the coils superheat the material. These all do the same purpose, they're just designed a little bit differently and have different applications. The next item we have to look at is whenever you're casting something, you have to look at the draft. And if we zoom in here a little bit, when we're looking at a draft on an item we're going to cast, that's actually the relief area when it's pressed in a mold. Because in order for it to be cast between two sandwiched layers like this, it has to have a certain type of curvature, or as we call in the casting, the draft, so it can easily fit into the mold and be removed. Items that don't have a reasonable draft for this type of casting usually have to do what's called lost wax technique. I'll later on talk more about that. So that's what draft is. Then you also have the flash. A lot of people, when they hear that, are thinking the flash is actually, it flares up or something like that. It's not really the case. The flash of casting is actually this. The little seam you get around the material. That's actually the flash. That's usually the part you also trim off. We had a flash that ran across this hammer, right across here, and that was trimmed off. You can still see part of the flash here and here. This is called the flash. Another term we want to talk about is impurities. All materials have impurities. This chunk of aluminum right here has a lot of different types of elements in there that aren't aluminum. And those would be impurities if we're not trying to make an alloy. And so impurities are materials in the casting substance that aren't supposed to be there. And another term that we often hear when casting is called inclusion. I'll be talking about that more later, but that's where you're trying to cast something inside of another mold. This would be like if you're making a knife and you're trying to cast a brass handle on it, or an aluminum handle. The metal component would actually be an inclusion in the mold. Other things we have to look at is investment mold. Later we'll talk about lost wax method, which is a type of investment mold making, or investment casting. We'll talk more about that in another video. We talked about this is the mold. The actual item we're pouring into is considered the mold. We have a pattern. This would be a pattern. That's the item you're casting. And then you also have to worry about some other things in casting, like shrinkage. Shrinkage is where the metal cools, and so your finished item is actually slightly smaller than the original. Many times if you're doing investment casting or things like that, you have to account for shrinkage to make sure the item is exactly right if there's some very strict specifications. Other things we want to talk about is the sprue and vent hole. The sprue is actually the physical area we pour the metal into. If we come right over here, I have a mold already made up, so I can show you. This large opening is actually the sprue, where the smaller opening is the vent hole. If you remember in the previous video, I looked at both openings and I said if you had a good cast, you can usually see the metal through the vent hole. I'm going to go ahead and open this up carefully, just so you guys can see the sprue and vent hole. The large opening is the sprue, and the smaller opening is the vent hole. So that would be sprue and vent hole. The last few terms I want to talk about are oil bonded sand. Oil bonded sand is what we are using here. This would be the Delft clay. This is oil bonded sand. You can actually have different types of casting clay. You have green sand casting and a whole bunch of terminology, but for today we're going to stick with oil bonded sand or the Delft clay. Then we have the crucible. We are using graphite crucibles, but remember it's also available in refractory clay. Depending on the material you're melting, you can use steel crucibles if you're melting low temp materials like pewter or lead. And so there's all kinds of options out there. Just know that what the charge is melted in is actually the crucible. And last but not least, a lot of you are familiar with this, slag. Whenever you cast, you end up with slag. Even if we look at this brass anvil right here, it has chunks of impurities that are actually forced to the surface from being heated. Those things are called slag. That's the general overview of some of the terminology you're going to hear commonly referred to in sand casting. And if you have any further questions, make sure to go ahead and ask me a question, drop me a line, whatever, and we'll try to get everything cleared up for you. Until then, I'll see you next time.